my distinguished ministerial colleagues, the Honorable Robson Ben and Dr. Vindhya Prasad, our visiting expert from the United Nations, Ms. Murdoch, the Director of Public Prosecutions, representatives from our important developmental partners, Assistant Commissioner of Police, Director of the project, Restorative Justice Project, senior ranks of the Guyana Police Force, the community leaders whom I see present here, members of the press, distinguished guests. This may be a very small and apparently on its face an unimportant exercise, but in due course I have no doubt that when the concept of restorative justice is fully understood and implemented and become a functional part of our criminal justice system and our society, those of us who are present here today will reflect upon this event and say to ourselves that we are happy that we were part of this initiative. It is not a coincidence, and neither is it insignificant, that only last week, led by our distinguished Prime Minister, Minister Ben, myself, and the Commissioner of Police attended a very important symposium in Trinidad and Tobago, which brought together the leaders of CARICOM to discuss violence in the region, and the consensual view arising out of that confabulation is that crime and criminality is an existential threat to Caribbean society. Crime is not only recognized now at the highest level to be pervasive, but crime and criminal conduct are now recognized to be sophisticated, to be complex, and to be very nuanced, both in their conception and the way criminal activities unfold. States and crime-fighting agencies, therefore, must respond correspondingly and must fashion new initiatives, new ideas, new strategies, including the employment of science and technology and the social analysis done, and incorporate that into an integrated approach if we are to effectively respond to the type of criminal conduct that pervades our society. So at every level of crime fighting, we have to become innovative and to pursue unconventional methods. The truth of the matter is that the strategies that we have employed over the last 100 years or more to deal with crime and criminality have not been successful. The reality is that we live in a society affected by crime and criminal conduct more than ever before. And what was recognized only last week in the Caribbean, that the situation is becoming more, or rather progressively worse, year by year. And at that level, resolutions have been made to overhaul not only the criminal justice system, but the whole approach to crime and criminal conduct. The investigative capabilities and strategies, the resort and incorporation of a more scientific approach to investigation, gathering evidence, and prosecution, as well as to incorporate all the available analysis and tools that are out there to address crime and criminality in the various countries of the Caribbean. Restorative justice is one of those. One of the newer innovations. It was birthed in the 1970s, and the United Nations have adopted it and embraced it as a workable concept, and has attempted over the years, and we heard from the representative of the UN here with us, unfortunately, with little success. And we heard of the limited number of jurisdictions across the globe that have embraced the concept in the manner that they should. Guyana is now one of the leading examples in this hemisphere of embracing this concept, introduce a governing legislation, and is now rolling out the programs and establishing the governance structure to apply its principles and to practice its precepts. It now being formally inducted by law into our criminal justice system. As Mrs. Anil said, this is something that we have worked on for 2 years now, and we trained employing experts, international experts in the field. We trained large number of persons right across the length and breadth of our country. Importantly, in leadership posts and in significant facets of national life. So community leaders are here, our religious leaders are here, teachers have been trained, our Amerindian leaders have been trained, the Guyana police force has been trained, our judiciary was trained, the director of public prosecutions and prosecutors were trained. So a lot of groundwork has already been done. But why I insisted in this type of launch is not because we want it to be done publicly. but because the success of the concept depends largely on societal participation. The press is here, and the mere fact that all these persons, these leaders on the East Coast are here, is a testimony to the fact of how important the public participation is. I said that the press is here because I'm depending on the press to continue to promote this concept, interrogate the concept, and work with us in bringing greater consciousness and public awareness to the concept across the country. Restorative justice is, as I said, a new area. It's ripe for academic investigation and examination. So I am hoping that at the University of Guyana, our social science students, our sociology students, and those pursuing areas of social works, etc., can use this concept of restorative justice as part of their academic pursuits, and more importantly, produce papers, do studies, examine empirical statistics that would all enable us to strengthen this concept and the project that we are embarking upon and launching today. So, what is restorative justice? We heard both from Minister Ben and from Minister Prasad about punitive justice and retributive justice. And those have been the dominant concepts in the penal component of our criminal justice system. Though punishment as a sanction that flows from delinquent social conduct, which are called laws, called criminal conduct under the criminal laws of our country. These sanctions, when they were originally conceived, had different components. So you have the punitive component, then you have the retributive component, and you have rehabilitative component. The emphasis, as we all know, and policemen in particular would know what I'm speaking about, the emphasis, whether rightfully or wrongfully, over the last 100 years has been more on the punitive, retributive components of the sanction, and not the rehabilitative component. And as I began by saying, it has not worked. So we tried death by hanging. We tried death by injection. We tried death by electrification. We tried flogging. We tried solitary confinement. We tried hard labor. We tried protracted and long sentences. Have they worked? We are living in a crime-infested society as never existed before. Both of my colleagues lamented the unfortunate death of a wife, a mother, a woman at the hands of a spouse. And we all know that that is not an isolated event. Perhaps before the end of the day, we may receive another report. And that's the reality of the society that we're living in. I make those points to present the compelling case, which I think is made out, for us to go back to the drawing board and rethink this approach to crime. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not at all for one moment advocating that criminal or sanctions should not bear a reasonable relationship with the crime committed. There must always be that. Violent crimes require the most condign response. So I don't want anyone to leave here to think or to say that I am advocating a soft approach. I'm not doing that at all. All I am saying is that we have to now be analytical in our approach, and where possible, focus attention in the new concepts that are evolving. And one of those new concepts is restorative justice. It is directed and by law shall only apply to non-violent offenses and what we can call minor offenses. Offenses under the Act that carries a term of imprisonment of 3 years and below. So that's the first thing I want to emphasize. Now, think about it. What type of offenses carry those types of penalties? And is it the best thing to put persons convicted of these minor offenses into the prison system for protracted periods, knowing full well that we don't have a prison system that is equipped as we would like to, and we are working towards remedying that, equipped to rehabilitate so that the person coming out is a better person than he was when he went in, or he comes out rehabilitated, reformed, and is able to reintegrate safely and constructively into society. Restorative justice offers another approach. It says, and it has many components. It says, first of all, it brings the victim and the perpetrator together, and it tries to repair that relationship. And it is a consensual mechanism. It, once human relations strained can be repaired, then that goes a far way in ensuring cordial relations. Hardly would you find violence erupting between persons who share harmonious and cordial relationships. Hardly. A very unlikely event. So this brings together the victim and the perpetrator and allows apologies to take place, allows compensation to be paid, and allows other forms of amends consensually worked out between the perpetrator and the victim. Of course, there is a facilitator who is engaging this, and that's the role that Mr. Sila Al-Prasad will play. He will head that facilitating unit, and he will employ all the persons who we have trained in this mediatory, conciliatory engagement. But it doesn't only address that interpersonal relationship, it goes further. And I believe this is even the more important component of it, is that it seeks to examine the underlying factors that resulted in the violent, criminal, or delinquent conduct. And it seeks to address that underlying problem. In my speech in the Parliament, when I presented this bill, I gave the example of a home where there is some form of abuse, sexual, domestic, physical, and that toxic environment is what has infected the perpetrator with the germ of that virus that resulted in his violent conduct. Sometimes it may be a mental issue, you don't even know. He goes before a magistrate, charged with an offense, he pleads guilty or is found guilty. He goes into the prison system, serves a sentence, perhaps becomes worse, or comes out perhaps a better person, or at least comes out the same way that he went in. But where does he go? He goes back into that toxic environment. And whatever the mental and psychological deficiencies and failings inherent in him are, they are now going to be excited. And they are going to be agitated once again, which will result in the very criminal conduct that he went into the prison for. And this vicious cycle continues unabated. Restorative justice allows us to go into that home, that toxic environment, and identify the source of the toxicity, and root it out once and for all. And that is why an important component of restorative justice involves teachers. It's not because it's not really teachers, it's the school, that important environment that our citizens enter at the age of about 5 or 6. And most of them, well, they ought to remain there for the next 15 years, 10 years of their life. Most importantly, it is at that stage, that learning stage, that their entire persona, personality, and character is being built, cultivated, and constructed. And it is that environment ultimately that will produce the citizen of Guyana when he becomes 18 years of age. And in those formative years, a teacher who is alive to the concepts and principles of restorative justice will be able to look, or should be able to look at the children's behavior in the classroom and detect that something is wrong, and begin that interrogation using the restorative justice doctrine and go and find the source of that wrong. The perpetrator of that brutal act that the two ministers spoke about, more likely than not, would have been evincing alarming signals at a very young age in the school system. And did we then have a discerning supervisor whose mind is conscious of these principles, and there was an institution in place and a law in place to begin that interrogation, perhaps we would not have that violent outburst that we spoke about. So, restorative justice provides that important platform. And also, it allows, and it does this without the prison system. So right there, we have reduction of the prison population. We save taxpayers money, and we are able to constructively use the limited resources that we have and the limited prison facilities to deal with persons who really should be there. So, restorative justice, Minister Ben spoke about South Africa. And it was introduced in South Africa. And there was a study done. And I want to share with you what the study says. I quote from the report. In this regard, the paradigm of restorative justice can make a new and valuable contribution. One of the basic tenets of restorative justice is that crime prevention is more likely to be achieved through social integration rather than ostracism and punishment. This is achieved through conferences between offenders and victims, where guilt is admitted, hurt is revealed, restitution is explored, commitment about future behavior is made, and the responsibility of carrying out obligations is shared. This is what the concept does. I have a statement by a judge in an Australian case in 2007 speaking on restorative justice. And I quote again, a restorative justice program, whether general or case specific, uses restorative processes and seeks to achieve restorative outcomes. A restorative process can be defined as any process in which the victim and the offender, and where appropriate, any other individual or community members affected by a crime, participate together actively in the resolution of the matter arising from the crime, generally with the help of a facilitator. A restorative outcome is an agreement reached as a result of a restorative process. The agreement may include the offender making reparation or restitution. I spoke about the facilitator, and I spoke about other members of society. What restorative justice does is that when, for example, a perpetrator violates a victim, the police in their investigation are going to charge the perpetrator, and the victim will testify and possibly an eyewitness. But the police will not, the investigation normally would not address how this behavior has affected the eyewitness. Let us assume it's a child We heard about children being the witness of this gruesome act that the two ministers spoke about. And Minister Ben did allude to how victims of crime are ignored. Restorative justice addresses all of that. It brings that person to the table, and that person's concerns and grievances will also be addressed. So it's very comprehensive in its approach. Now, reference was made to Rwanda. We know what transpired in Rwanda 20 odd years ago. Over 1 million persons were slaughtered in the most brutal way. Persons were invited to go to church and slaughtered in the church. Persons were invited to go to sporting events, and then the gates were closed and they were slaughtered in that venue. That's the type of violence I'm speaking about. Persons who lived like brothers and sisters their entire life. When the tribal differences were exploited, they turned against each other and brutalized and mutilated each other like animals. I had the privilege of visiting Rwanda recently. I said Somalia just now? Or Rwanda? Rwanda. And I went to a museum where some of these atrocities and the effects of them, well, the atrocities, they have recordings and some pictures and photographs of the aftermath. Guyana doesn't have 1 million people, you know that. We have 750,000 here about. 1 million people. 1 million people died and along the roadways. And it's a relatively small country. So you could imagine the sight. Just imagine the sight, the stench and everything else. The United Nations intervened, and the victims, the surviving relatives of those who were slaughtered and killed, they engaged with the United Nations, and tribunals were established to inquire into these horrendous killings. On one condition. And you know what the condition was? The condition was that no one will suffer the death penalty. I am talking about an entire family being wiped out except one person who may have been a child at the time, now an adult, agreed for these inquiries to be done, and the perpetrators who are still there, they must not suffer the death penalty, though they slaughtered thousands and, well, nearly 1 million people. Now, I am saying that if, and that's a form of restorative justice, though that is not going to happen here. There's a form of restorative justice there. Because part of it had brought together the surviving victims and the perpetrators. And that is the most extreme global example of restorative justice at work. And it worked. As I said, I visited there a few months ago, and it's one of the most beautiful places in that part of the world. Peace, calm, tranquility. You could have never suspected that there was a genocide there 2 decades ago. If that was achieved in Rwanda, why we can't achieve restorative justice in its most elementary form, being applied to the most minor of offenses in our country? Mr. Silal Prasad will determine the outcome of that question. Mr. Silal Prasad brings to the post wide experience as a former commissioner of police, engaged in law enforcement his entire life, and understands, importantly, the idiosyncrasies and peculiarities of the Guyanese society, having worked in almost every geographic area in this country, interacting with Guyanese from every race, every ethnicity, every religious background, and in every geographic part of Guyana. He has training in the area of restorative justice, and in my humble view, is suitably qualified to lead this pilot initiative, and I have no doubt will demonstrate his competence in leading the national initiative when we reach that stage. This pilot, as we heard, will unfold in a particular part of the East Coast, and it was situated there because the location used was sufficiently proximate to the urban center of Georgetown. The locality captured in the pilot exercise embraces the racial configuration of our country. So the pilot project will be able to go into diverse communities and work with them so that at the end we can get recommendations and we can get the type of results that would justify it becoming a national project to be unrolled right across the length and breadth of Guyana. I am very pleased as the minister who has been afforded the opportunity to share this initiative with the Guyanese people and to have played a role in introducing it formally into the legal system of our country. It is my hope and expectation that it will become a permanent feature of our national and legal landscape. I thank you very much.